Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to the Capitalist Cast. Joining us today is Senator Joe Pittman. Senator Pittman, can you tell us a little bit about your district?
Good afternoon, Leo. Thanks for having me. Yes, I represent the 41st Senatorial District, which currently includes all of Armstrong County, all of Indiana County, and then, about a third of Butler County, the eastern portion of Butler, and then a smaller piece of Westmoreland County that mainly includes the Murraysville area. So it's a fairly large district geographically. Like all other state senators, I represent about 250,000 people within that district. And of course, that will all change here once the census numbers and reapportionment occur. But the district I represent is in Western PA. It is northeast of Pittsburgh, the area along the Route 28 and 22 corridors. And it's very economically dependent on the production of energy and all the natural resources that come with that: coal, natural gas, as well as timbering and other resource use for our economy.
And that the energy production and the use of coal and natural gas and everything like that really dovetails into what we wanted to talk about today.
Okay.
You have introduced legislation last session and again this session on the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which we'll just shorten down to RGGI as we're talking. Can you talk to folks what exactly is RGGI and how does it relate to energy production?
RGGI is basically a carbon tax. Now, we could use the words carbon trading or carbon allowances, but the bottom line is any power plant in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania that produces power and emits carbon would be subject to a fee for the privilege of emitting carbon. And keep in mind what carbon is. It's what you and I exhale. And that is the approach of RGGI. My concern is that this multi-state compact makes our production of electricity uncompetitive compared to our neighbors. We are an exporter of electricity in Pennsylvania. And if you look at what happened just this past week in Texas, you will see that our resources of energy were very important in not only powering the grid that we depend on, but also other grids through the rest of the country. And so my concern is that candidly, we're going to allow for a windfall to other states such as West Virginia and Ohio, while we discourage the production of electricity in this Commonwealth.
Yeah, so this is similar in the idea to the cap and trade stuff that the Obama administration, had initially started talking about. As you mentioned, the difference is this is more regional. This is only a few states participating in it. What are the boundaries? What does that look like as far as who would be participating? And you had mentioned, that even our neighboring states would benefit at our cost.
Correct. So you have to understand a couple boundaries. First is the boundary of RGGI, and it's a compact of 9 states, all in the Northeast. The newest member is the state of Virginia, as well as the state of New Jersey, and New York, and the New England states. We are also part of what's called the PJM Power Grid, which is the Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland Power Grid, and it is in charge of supplying power to approximately 13 states through the Mid-Atlantic over into the Midwest. So power produced in Pennsylvania could end up in West Virginia or North Carolina. Power produced in West Virginia could end up in New Jersey. The bottom line is our power plants compete against power plants throughout the entire PJM grid. So if you have a coal-fired power plant in Ohio, a natural gas plant in West Virginia, they will be at a competitive advantage compared to our coal and natural gas plants here in Pennsylvania. And that is where the fundamental problem comes in, and why I say that this is an economic windfall to states that are not in RGGI, but are within our power grid.
And your approach, you guys in the Senate and in the House passed some legislation last session. Can you talk a little bit about what that legislation was going to do before
Right.
the governor obviously vetoed it, but just so people have an understanding of what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, we've worked in not only a bicameral partnership, but also a bipartisan partnership. It's Representative Struzzi, who represents Indiana County, Representative Oberlander, who is the whip in the House, and also Representative Pam Snyder from Greene County, all introduced legislation identical to what I introduced in the Senate. And the bottom line is that legislation simply says, if you are going to enter into RGGI and you're going to implement this carbon tax, the legislature must approve that tax and that admission into RGGI. That's all it says. It doesn't even say that we can't. It just says that we, as a co-equal branch of government, elected to represent our constituents, deserve to have a voice and a seat at the table when you're going to institute a tax of this magnitude that could greatly impact our economic well-being. That's what the bill did. It actually did draw some very large bipartisan support. We got 33 votes in the state Senate. The House, I believe they got 120 some votes, but the governor did veto it. We have reintroduced it in this session, and my hope is that we will continue to advance the issue.
How is the governor, what's his legal reasoning? How is he proposing to get into this without legislative approval as it stands? Because I mean, it definitely sounds like this is an overreach on the part of the executive branch.
He's relying on a statute, the Air Pollution Control Act, and he's relying on some language in there that intimates that the governor has the responsibility to ensure that the Commonwealth has clean air and that he has the ability to pursue policies that help to ensure that. So that's his argument. I mean, it's really a convenient way for him to try to get what he wants without engaging us, because he knows full well that we're not going to, in my opinion, allow us to become beholden to this interstate compact and put us at an economic disadvantage without some very, very hard questions being answered first.
Yeah, and it's interesting, you bring up the fact that this had bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm.
I know I've been reviewing a lot of material related to it, and this isn't, your typical conservative versus liberal kind of issue. What we're seeing is a lot of pushback from traditionally Democratic allies, particularly in the area of organized labor. You have folks who are in your district who work in power plants. There are power plants all across the state. Do you have any idea what kind of impact this would have in terms of job losses? What would we be looking at?
It would have a massive impact in terms of direct job losses. The estimate is approximately 8,000 jobs throughout Western Pennsylvania, and that's much more than just the direct employees of these power plants, but also the coal miners, the members of the trade unions, the boilermakers, the electrical workers that work on the maintenance of these facilities, and then of course the logistics and the transportation. So it's a broad-based issue, and even aside from the jobs, you have to look at the cost of power if we do this, number one, and number two, in my area, these power plants pay significant amounts of property taxes. I have it estimated at about $5 million of property tax payments every year that are paid by my carbon emitting power plants. I have 3 coal-fired power plants, a waste coal power plant, and a natural gas plant that have the capacity of producing 6,000 megawatts of electricity just within my borders, and they pay property taxes, a lot of property taxes. So I find it ironic that the governor proposes a massive increase in the personal income tax in the support of public education, and yet he's proposing policies that would absolutely devastate the public education network within my district. It's a bitter irony for me, and it's part of the reason why I'm so passionate about this. This will deny the families and the children that I represent an opportunity to have a free, equal, and fair education. And I resent his effort to deny them that.
Yeah, and you bring up a good point, because it's not just a matter of the jobs that are directly related to it. You have, as you mentioned, the property taxes that are generated by it, the income taxes that are generated by the energy production itself, and also by the energy extraction. And then you also have the issue of the cost of energy itself. And when you look at what that's going to do, how would energy costs go up, and how would something like that be passed on to consumers? And I mean, as a consumer, everybody needs electricity to power their home. So how would this be passed on to, individual consumers, and then how would this be passed on to businesses that are, much larger consumers of electricity?
Well, in a couple ways. One, if you're a power plant in Pennsylvania that emits carbon and you choose to attempt to operate, you will pay more for the production of that electricity, because you're going to have to pay for the privilege of emitting carbon. The other option is that power plants in our Commonwealth will close. And what that does is it makes the marketplace less competitive, because you have a less variety of power sources to supply the grid. If you look at the PJM pie chart that shows the sources of power and where they come from, you will find that you have nuclear power at 33,000 megawatts. Nuclear power is what it is. It's always producing that amount of power. It can't produce more, it can't produce less. You have renewables that are typically about 8 to 10% of the grid. And then you have natural gas and coal. And coal has been on the decline, largely because we have a more efficient and cheaper source of natural gas. But those are the only two sources of energy that have the ability to ebb and flow with the demands of power. And what you saw this past week with Texas is that we were actually exporting power because our coal plants and our natural gas plants were up and running to the max and pushing power into other power grids. If you wipe out coal, for example, then you have a power grid that's beholden to natural gas, and it becomes an uncompetitive marketplace. And if you push our power plants out of Pennsylvania, then you've increased production in Ohio and West Virginia. And guess what? They emit carbon. And guess what? We don't live in a bubble. And so we've basically pushed the carbon emission out of Pennsylvania to the states to the west of us at our own expense.
Yeah, and then not only at the expense of jobs, but also at, as you mentioned, the expense of increased, increased energy costs.
Mm-hmm.
And that is something that is going to impact, pretty much everybody. So looking at this, I know we've had another guest, a gentleman named Greg Wrightstone, who is a petroleum geologist, and wrote a couple of really interesting books. And one of the things that we learned in conversation with him is a lot of these proposed the carbon tax that from RGGI, the Transportation Climate Initiative, because we're talking about just having a small regional consortium enact this, there's really no impact on overall carbon emissions. And even if we eliminated all of the carbon emissions from our state and some of these other states, there's really no impact on global temperatures.
If you look at what China and India are doing in terms of powering up, they are adding megawatts, gigawatts of power, primarily from coal. In fact, the real galling part of this is if you close the coal plants I represent, their bones will be picked, they'll be put on a train, they'll be put on a barge, and they'll be sent to India and China, and they'll be rebuilt. And I guarantee you, they'll be rebuilt without the emission standards that we already have in place. And so I look at this as much more than an environmental conversation. This is a national security issue. This is an economic issue. And if you look at what happened again in the state of Texas, they failed for multiple reasons. One, they have an isolated grid. Two, natural gas got pulled off the power grid for the heating of homes. We had windmills literally freeze up because they weren't weatherized. And you had coal plants that were offline for maintenance because it was the smaller time of year. Every source of energy that we consume has a weakness. And the only way we overcome those weaknesses is by having those energy sources complement each other. And that's what we need now more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. So we started off the conversation talking about the legislation that was passed and vetoed. You've introduced legislation. Legislation has been introduced in the House and Senate again. Can you walk us through what does the legislative process look like, not just on this piece of legislation, but just in general? How's this going to work?
Well, we have the bills introduced. They've been assigned to the various committees. In this case, in the Senate, the Environmental Resources and Energy Committee. Senator Gene Yaw, who is the chair, has been a real champion on this issue. And my hope would be that we would move it through committee and eventually get it to the floor for a vote. And my real hope and expectation would be that we may actually get additional votes in this legislative session, because we've really had an opportunity to hone in on the substantive flaws with this policy. And I have to say, too, you mentioned organized labor. They have been a tremendous ally in this process. The trade unions, the Boilermakers, the electrical workers, the iron workers, the operating engineers, the laborers, you go down the list of trade unions, and they have all been lockstep in support of this legislation, because they recognize what this means in terms of family sustaining maximum wage jobs. You know, we have a governor that wants to raise the minimum wage. Well, God bless him. He's looking to raise the minimum wage, and yet every chance he gets, he tries to eliminate maximum wage jobs. But they have been real allies in this. I think their eyes have been opened up even more when you see what President Biden did on day one with the Keystone XL pipeline. They recognize that we need a strong, diverse, resilient power grid, and that power grid translates into real family sustaining jobs. And so my hat's off to the trade unions. I've enjoyed our partnership and friendship, candidly, on this issue. And I look forward to working with them to get us out of this quagmire.
Yeah, and it sounds like so since it was passed last session, do you anticipate there being a lot of hearings and everything again this time around, or do you see this being a slightly quicker process?
My hope is that it would be a quicker process. I'm not sure what needs to be said more. 3 of DEP's advisory committees have already rejected this regulation, and yet DEP continued to move forward with it. The Independent Regulatory Review Commission just came out with some very scathing comments about this proposed regulation and suggested at a minimum that they have a one-year moratorium on our entry into RGGI. So I think the time for talk is done. It's time for us to act and move forward, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do that in short order.
Yeah, and that the regulatory commission, just that report just came out last week, didn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So this is an ongoing, this is kind of a drumbeat of, hey, this is a really bad idea. And as we've been mentioning pretty much the whole time, this isn't just a conservative versus liberal kind of thing. These are the regulators who oversee all these things, saying, look, this is not smart. This is a bad idea.
Right.
So, recognizing, hopefully, if we get a larger bipartisan majority who would be willing to override the governor's veto, assuming that he would veto it again. Hopefully we get that size majority. If we don't, are there any other options that are being considered? Has the Senate, or for what you're able to speak to it, looked at what they can do during the budget process in order to make implementation of something like this more difficult?
Well, I think from my vantage point as just one vote in one chamber of the legislature, to me, all options should be on the table in trying to thwart this. My real hope is that the governor will come to his senses. He now has the president he wants. He now has the federal agenda on climate issues. And candidly, if we're going to move forward, this should be a national approach beyond putting us as Pennsylvania at a competitive disadvantage compared to our competitor states. And so my hope is that he comes to his senses and he sets this aside. But I'm here to fight this till the end. I believe it's an illegal tax. And if we have to go a legal route, I'm certainly open and willing to do that. But there's just too much at stake in the region I represent for families who rely on these jobs. You know, we don't have enough family sustaining jobs in this Commonwealth. It's why we're in the situation we're in. And to throw them away willfully through government action, to me, is just asinine. And so I'm hoping we use every tool in the toolbox. But ultimately, I pray that the governor takes a step back and looks at the damage that he's about to inflict for very little positive return on the global picture, as you pointed out earlier.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a really good point about the family sustaining jobs. And it's important to recognize that while a lot of these jobs are obviously these are jobs that in your district, what folks don't recognize is that some of these positions, they're, for lack of a better term, almost mobile positions. If you have an expertise, as a boilermaker or as an electrical engineer or an electrician or some of these other very highly skilled positions, you're going to a power plant. You may be traveling there from south. You may be traveling to Western Pennsylvania from southeastern Pennsylvania. Sometimes they're not necessarily permanent jobs, but the way that they build up the opportunities and the number of opportunities for people to be able to support their families is just, it goes beyond just that headline number.
You're right. And I have Boilermakers in the district I represent who are going to West Virginia and Ohio to work on outages at coal-fired and natural gas-fired power plants instead of working on those plants here in Pennsylvania. And as their business agent says, they'd much rather be packing a lunchbox than a suitcase.
Yeah.
They're going out of state, they're living in hotel rooms, they're going away from their families, and they're essentially exporting employment out of the Commonwealth when they could be right here at home working on our assets, our power plants, and keeping those resources in the Commonwealth.
Yeah, and that in and of itself has other follow-on, problems that the governor likes to point to. The child care expenses and all these other things. Well, none of these issues you can't look at them in a vacuum. And I appreciate the holistic approach that you're taking to this, and just really that folks are seeing this as this isn't just about the electricity being generated in one senatorial district, or even just the electricity being generated in one state. This is about everything that follows along with it. It's about the jobs. It's about the ability for people to come home at the end of the day and see their family, rather than, like you said, working out of a suitcase for weeks on end. These are really big issues, and for someone, or for our governor to try and present this and to present himself as someone who's, fighting for the little guy and, really wanting to decrease inequality and things like that. All of these actions just really just fly in the face of that kind of rhetoric.
They really do, Leo, and it's why I take this so personally. The region I represent, economically, we got our teeth kicked in throughout the 80s and 90s when coal mines and steel mills closed. And those power plants have been resilient. They've been mainstays of our economy. And I realize nothing is forever. And I realize market forces have driven other coal plants out of business, and that these plants are older and they may someday go out of business. That is a reality. But for the heavy hand of government to come in and squash them and put all of these folks out of jobs is appalling to me. And what I hear, I think of what Richard Trumka would always say about unemployed coal miners turning into unemployed computer programmers. We don't need unemployed workers in our power sector to be trained for jobs that don't exist in our region. We need those jobs to exist in our region. And for all the talk I hear about green jobs, I don't see them in my neck of the woods. Now, if you're going to walk into my district and you're going to say, you know what, we're going to replace those 8,000 jobs with 8,000 green jobs that pay just as much and provide those kinds of benefits and that kind of quality of life, then I'm ready to talk. But until I see that, I'm not sure what there is to discuss.
Yeah, and that's a great point. A lot of you heard John Kerry talking about, well, we'll get them green jobs. Well, that's just not it. It's spoken like someone who's never actually had to worry about finding a new job.
Yep.
You're not just talking about taking away a small part of the economy in some of these areas. You're talking about, essentially taking away all of it. And as you mentioned, when these plants, which are older, reach the end of their lifespan, that's a natural process. That's something that occurs, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, really just putting the thumb on the scale and saying, these are no longer, it's no longer productive to use. Not only is it no longer productive to use, but it's not even worth building a natural gas plant in that area, which is another possibility, because we've seen natural gas plants pop up all over the place in Pennsylvania because of those energy costs.
You're absolutely right, Leo. In these power plants, in some ways, they have outlived their useful life over this period of time, but they have reinvested in them.
Right.
When these plants were built, you literally had coal mines right next to them. They dumped the coal on the ground, they'd shove it in the power plant, and there's your power. Well, as time has gone on, the source of energy, the fuel supply, has gone away from the plants. So they invested in infrastructure. They invested in rail lines. They invested in load-out facilities. And then they invested in emissions controls. I mean, they've upgraded these plants. They've made them more efficient. And honestly, I think there's a future in carbon capture sequestration technology. You see Consol Energy right now on the beginning stages of a carbon capture sequestration coal-fired power plant in southwestern Pennsylvania. If that model proves out to be effective, that could be an opportunity for our power plants to repower and re-energize. But I can't do it if they're dead.
Yep.
We have to have going concerns. And so if nothing else, we need a runway. We need an opportunity to allow them to reinvent themselves, to revitalize. I have one power plant, the Seward Power Plant. It was an old coal-fired power plant. 20 years ago, they came in, they repowered it, and they made it the largest waste coal plant on the planet. It chews up bony dumps, bony piles. It eliminates acid mine drainage. It cleans up the environment, and it creates electricity by making that reuse. That was a repowered project, a repurposed project. We've done it before, and I don't know any reason why we can't do it again.
Yeah, and that's another interesting kind of point. We have a lot of these, a lot of plants that have retooled in order to use waste coal and things of that nature. And that was, again, government funding to make those jobs happen. So we're essentially taking money that was spent, 15, 20 years ago by the government as, the next big thing in order to be environmentally friendly. And now, a short time later, that same government turning around and saying, "Whoa, we can't do this anymore. This is no longer environmentally friendly. We're not going to do this anymore. We're going to put you out of business."
Right. It's a difficult sequence, and sometimes I think it's a good example of how government policies ebb and flow to the point of being inconsistent and then counterproductive.
Yeah, it's on a much larger scale of during the Depression, the federal government had a program that taught farmers how to raise chickens, and then they had to turn around and have a program for the government to buy up the eggs because there was an overage in egg supply. So that's just the way the government does things. Well, I
Right.
want to thank you for taking some time today, for coming on and explaining all about what this is. I know I really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that our viewers enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much, Senator Pittman. It was a pleasure having you on today.
Leo, thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to have the platform. I encourage all your viewers and listeners to engage your legislators, engage the governor, let them know that this is an issue of concern to you, because we are not mind readers and we need to hear from the people we represent. So thank you very much.
And thank you, sir. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You as well. Take care.